Hello and congratulations. You've made it to the final recorded lecture for course. There will be a review for the final exam, but this is the last of the content. So we've uh, seen a model for decision making in the last lecture, and now we're going to apply that uh, to evaluating decisions. So now we're going to develop a model for evaluating decisions. So we're going to jump right into this. Will probably be a relatively short lecture. We're going to jump right into the program itself, right? So step one would be identify the available options, right? You should recall that from the last lecture. So maybe your options are betting on red, betting on green, betting on blue if we're playing our marble game, right? Or in real life things like attending, right, state university or attending out of state university. Identify the options and make sure that they're formulated to be mutually exclusive and jointly exhaustive. Um, Step two, identify the possible states of the world that are relevant to that decision. Um, Again, with our jar of marbles, that would mean, a red marble is drawn as one possible state of the world, a blue one is drawn, a green one, and um, in our football example, it was play football at OSU or we don't play football at OSU, right? We play football at SU or we don't play football at SU. So all the possible ways the world could go that are relevant to those options. And again, those also need to be formulated so as to be mutually exclusive and jointly exhaustive. That may require, that's slightly artificial, right? Real life may not be always be exactly like that, but we can certainly sort of frame it in that way and rule out sort of options or possible states of the world that are so low probability that they're not worth considering. Um, Step three, then you want to look at the outcomes. So this program looks very similar to constructing the matrix. Right? So this should be relatively straightforward. Um, so build the decision matrix. It will just be, right, options times states of the world, and that should contain all the possible outcomes, right, of the decision. All right, so now step four, we assign values to each of the possible outcomes in the matrix. You can just write them in little boxes. I think with these, it's helpful to actually draw it out, right? Even if in all of our sort of programs for evaluating decisions, you may have found it helpful to draw out various boxes for the various kinds of evaluations for scientific episodes. Maybe even more so here. I think you have to keep track of all these values and perform mathematical operations on them. Actually drawing the little matrix and popping your numbers in there. That'd be hard to keep all those going in your head, I would think. All right, so the first four steps are just setting up the matrix, right, and filling in the blanks. Um, Now, step five, uh, given the matrix you have, um, what sort of decision strategy would be most appropriate to the problem as formulated, right? Um, is it decision making under certainty? Is it decision making under uncertainty? Is it decision making with risk? Um, Making with risk, that means you know the probabilities, right, of the various states of the world as well, and you'll want to jot those down in your matrix as well. Um, and then finally, your evaluation. Oh, and given that you've decided, oh, okay, this is decision making under risk or this is decision making under uncertainty, as we've seen, you have various strategies, right, for approaching those decisions. Um, Maybe you are a gambler, right? Maybe you want to play it safe. Um, it's up to you, given the details, what you think is the most appropriate. Um, if it's just calculate expected utility and go with the highest expected utility, then do that. But there's some leeway there for your own sort of interpretation of the situation there. Um, and then step six, evaluation. So given all that, right, given the matrix, given the strategy you've chosen, is there one option that is recommended, right? And if so, why? Is there more than one option that can be recommended, right? If you're going for, if your strategy is to choose the best option, right, or the safest option, and there's more than one safe option, um, nothing to distinguish them, uh, can happen, right? That's fine too. But just explain, right, given the whole matrix, your choice of a strategy, what option is recommended. So now we'll get into some examples that should help us flesh these out. All right, here are some examples from the text, and these are deliberately chosen because I think they give sometimes surprising answers, right? So one example is a decision involving a low probability. So we get this sort of scientific information all the time, I think, where they do determine that something is a causal factor in some effect, but with relatively low effectiveness, right? I saw this when my wife was pregnant, we were having a child, right? There's all sorts of factors that have a very low effectiveness and causing some problem for the fetus, right? Eating sushi, drinking wine, things like that. A glass of wine certainly is not going to guarantee damage to your child, right? Drinking a great deal of alcohol has a higher chance of damaging your child, and so you would have these situations where it's like, oh, well, it's a causal factor. I better not ever do anything, right? Not eat anything that might be delicious or anything like that. And this, I think, is an example similar to those. I think recently there has been sort of reevaluation of sort of decision-making practice based on scientific studies. So if there's even any slight causal right effect, then we should like make a big deal out of it. Let's look at this one in detail, right? This was mentioned previously in chapter 8, a study that showed an effect of taking birth control pills, oral contraceptives, as a positive causal factor in breast cancer. They did conclude that there was good evidence, right, that the use of oral contraceptives was a positive causal factor. Great, we have a little piece of knowledge, but separate question, what we should do with that knowledge. How should that affect our decision whether or not to take birth control pills? Well, they found that the probability of breast cancer in women under 36 not using birth control pills would be about 1 in 500, right? So if you're under 36 and you don't use birth controls, you still have a 1 in 500 chance of getting breast cancer, right? And they found that if you use birth control pills, that probability increased to a 1 in 300 chance of getting breast cancer, which is a big difference, right? That's a 70% increase, and that sounds pretty scary. So the question is, should we outlaw birth control pills? Should we never take them? Well, this is what our program is for. So step one, what are our available options? Now, this is where you'll find, right, that all of a sudden, when we're building this matrix, we have to sort of artificially constrain the available options, right? In reality, we have many more options than taking oral birth control pills and not taking, right, not using contraception. There's many contraceptive methods that are pictured here. So if you formulate the options as take birth control or don't, right, assuming that these oral contraceptives are the only kind of birth control you could use, that's obviously artificial and would bias your decision in favor of taking them, right? Again, the realistic options between oral contraceptives and many other types of contraceptives, and even within the taking birth control pills option, there's lots of variation in there, like for how long are you going to take it, right? Do you only take it when you're in a relationship, or you only take it in particular relationships? So again, you'll find this is the case, right? When you're formulating the options, this is going to be slightly unrealistic, but nonetheless, we can still get interesting information that will help us make decisions out of it. Right? So, for our purposes, we will only consider two options, which is using oral contraceptives for more than 4 years and not using oral contraceptives at all. And the reason is because that's the only data we have. Right? That will study, right? The information from the study you're evaluating will guide your decision. You're only going to have limited information. Your options will be limited by that. All right, step two, what are the states of the world? Again, the only information we have is getting breast cancer and not getting breast cancer. So those are the states of the world that we're concerned about. Again, that's a very narrow set of relevant states. You might wonder sort of how aggressive breast cancer is. What are the other benefits, right? There are lots of benefits of taking birth control, right, that may in some ways outweigh. So again, because the study only really gives us these two options and these two outcomes, we're going to evaluate our decision just based on that information that we have. So given this limited set of two options and two states of the world, we end up with a relatively small matrix of four possible outcomes, right? So you might use oral contraceptives and still get breast cancer, right? You might use oral contraceptives and not get breast cancer. You might not use oral contraceptives but still get breast cancer, and you might not use oral contraceptives and not get breast cancer. Those are four things that could happen, right? Step four, assigning values. That's, again, assigning values is always going to be a personal matter, right? We can make some assumptions, right, that most people would prefer. We can certainly rank things, right, even if it's hard to assign specific probabilities, which we will do, right, but certainly the value of taking the birth control pills is control over your reproductive life, and that's a plus, right? Breast cancer is obviously going to be a negative for all people, right? So we should be able to, at the very least, rank these, right? Being able to take birth control, having the benefits of those, and not get breast cancer is going to be like the first choice, clearly. And then not getting to take birth control is like not having that control over your life, and also getting breast cancer, anyways, that's going to be in the bottom, and we're going to have to rank the other two. Okay, moving on. Okay, we've got our four outcomes, and the ranking is pretty clear, right? The best outcome would be you get to use oral contraceptives, you get all the benefits of that, and you don't get breast cancer. Right? The worst outcome would be you don't use oral contraceptives, you get none of those benefits, and you get breast cancer anyway. So using oral contraceptives and not getting breast cancer, we assign a value of 1. So this is the Ramsey method. So I feel this may be probably of these two lectures, the most confusing part. So let's try to walk through this step by step. And as an aside, you may have noticed that I skipped the von Neumann Morgenstern part of the book. That's not going to be on the exam. The only thing I'm going to take from that, so the Ramsey approach, right, talked about these ethically neutral propositions like flipping a coin or rolling a die or whatever. And one thing the von Neumann version adds is that instead of sort of imagining yourself rolling a dice, you just sort of like think about a lottery that has some probability of you winning, right? So you can just sort of more quickly just assign a certain sort of value, right? So let's walk through how that would work in this situation. Hopefully that'll help if anyone was confused on that after reading the text and watching the last lecture. Again, according to Ramsey, we take our most preferred outcome, assign it a value of 1, our least preferred outcome, assign it a value of 0. How would we assign the value of using contraceptives, right? In general, our approach here is going to be that we're going to assume a very low value. That's deliberate here. Now, in real life, people may assign a much higher value, right, to contraceptives. But there's a reason for doing that here, and that is because in the end, a little spoiler, but it's going to turn out that even if you assign very little value, right, utility to using the contraceptives, it's still going to turn out that the right decision or the decision with the highest expected utility is going to be to use them, right? It might be a surprising outcome, right? Obviously, if you assigned a higher value, you would still it would that you should, the right decision is to use the contraceptives, but we're getting the surprising result that even if you put a very low value on it, right, it'll turn out. Okay, so here's how that works. So we're going to say that we're assigning a value of 0.01 using contraceptives. So according to Ramsey's strategy, what does that mean, right? That means that I give you two choices, right? I say you could use oral contraceptives and get breast cancer, right? You could have that outcome guaranteed, right? Or here's another choice. We'll run a little lottery, right? And there's two ways it could turn out. You might get your first choice, which is to use oral contraceptives and not get breast cancer, or if you lose the lottery, you'll get the worst choice, which is not to get to use the oral contraceptives and get breast cancer, right? And the way the lottery is going to work is you got a 0.01% chance, right, of getting the best outcome. A 1% chance, sorry, not 0.01, a 1% chance, right, of getting the best outcome. So do you want to take the guaranteed outcome of you get to use oral contraceptives, but get breast cancer, or do you want to take the lottery, right, and have a 1% chance of getting the best outcome, 99% chance of getting the worst outcome? And if you say, I have no preference, right, between those two, taking the guaranteed, right, use oral contraceptives and get breast cancer, or doing the lottery where there's a 1% chance that I get my favorite outcome, I have no preference whatsoever. I'm indifferent between these two. Then that is the value you assign to using oral contraceptives, 1%. Right? That helps, right? Makes sense. We'll do it again when we get to the next example, right? And hopefully more examples, it'll make sense to you. So if that's the kind of lottery where you're indifferent, right, that means you assign a value of 0.01, right, to using contraceptives, which intuitively means that, right, in the outcomes where you don't get to use the contraceptives, that's sort of a 1% reduction in your sort of whatever quality of life. So we assign that 0.99, or you don't get breast cancer, right? But you didn't get to use the contraceptives, so that outcome is a little less preferable, the same amount, right, as it was as contraceptives and getting breast cancer. It's like a 1% difference, right? So hopefully that's intuitive. Right? Okay, so that is how we are assigning the values, and now we've completed our matrix. So strategies. For the moment, right, before we add the probabilities, because we do have some knowledge about states of the world, let's think about just the value matrix on its own, right, without any knowledge. Treat it as a problem of decision making under uncertainty. Here we have a clearly best option, right, even though we have no information about the world. Using oral contraceptives, right, whether you get breast cancer or don't, the value comes out higher, right? You get 0.01 compared to 0 and 1 compared to 0.99. So if we knew nothing about it, it would seem like yes, you should use the oral contraceptives, right? However, we do have some information that really changes the situation, right? So we do need now to apply the probabilities we know about states of the world to this matrix. The information we have, right, is that the probability of getting breast cancer if you've used oral contraceptives and you're younger than 36, 1 in 300, so about 0.003. The probability if you don't use oral contraceptives is 1 in 500 or 0.002, right? So because the states of getting and not getting breast cancer are exclusive and exhaustive, that means the corresponding probabilities of not getting breast cancer are 299 out of 300, 0.997, and 499 out of 500, 0.9. So, right, those you can see that's just the complement, right? So 1 minus 0.003 gives us 0.997. 1 minus 0.002 gives us 0.998, right? so that we have filled out now on the matrix. You can see down there. So using oral contraceptives, getting breast cancer, it's got a utility of 0.01 and it's got a probability of 1 in 300, right? Using oral contraceptives and not getting breast cancer has a utility of 1 and a probability of 299 out of 300, right? So notice you're overwhelmingly likely not to get breast cancer, right? Even if you use oral contraceptives, right? It does increase your chances, but from 1 in 500 to 1 in 300, right? So that's still a 299 out of 300 chance that you're not going to get it, right? So hopefully those numbers make sense, right? So now we just calculate the expected utility, right? So the expected utility if you use oral contraceptives, right, is both possible outcomes sort of added together, right? So the utility of the first outcome, right, which is getting breast cancer is 0.01 times 0.003, and you add that to the utility of not getting breast cancer, and that's going to be the value, the expected utility. It's going to be 1 times 0.997. You add those together, and you get, right, the first term there is just vanishingly small. It's 0.00003, right? So it doesn't really change the ultimate value. We just rounded to 0.997, right? Same with the other one is multiplied by 0, right? We're not using oral contraceptives. It'll be, the utility is 0, so it'll be 0 times 0.002, which will be 0, and then the expected utility of not getting breast cancer, 0.99 times the probability, 0.998, which gives us 0.988. So it turns out that the expected utility of using oral contraceptives is greater than the expected utility of not using oral contraceptives. That's supposed to be a little surprising, right? You hear, oh, this causes breast cancer. You think, oh, I better avoid that thing, right? But when the probabilities are low, it can increase your chances and increase it significantly, but still the overall, sometimes what we call the base rate of probability of getting breast cancer is so low that not outweigh even a tiny utility that you assign to using oral contraceptives. You're 0.01, right? Very small, right? Very conservative value we place on the benefits of using contraceptives. But even placing that tiny amount of utility in this sort of situation says you should use oral contraceptives, even if they in fact are a positive causal factor. So that should be interesting, right? Turns out expected utility for using oral contraceptives is higher, right? Even when we put a very low value in, like I said. And in fact, in this case, it turned out that knowing the probabilities didn't actually change the outcome from the version where it was decision making with uncertainty, and we didn't know the probabilities. And the reason for that should be fairly obvious, right? It's a very small difference in the probabilities. In either case, the probabilities were very low of breast cancer. It just makes a very small difference in the expected utility. So turns out if you're under 36, that study shouldn't really affect your decision at all about whether to take pills. Right? And again, going back to sort of when my wife was pregnant, we sort of looked at data, and there's a useful book that went through that. And it turned out, yeah, that not eating sushi for 9 months just doesn't. It's not worth, right, choosing to abstain from a glass of wine, right, or a sushi dinner. Increase in probability of an adverse effect on the child is so low that well, importantly, sorry, not so much the increase, like percentage increase in the probability, as we saw, it was a 70% increase here, right? But because the baseline probabilities were so low, even the 70% increase was such a low probability that if you assign any utility at all to having a glass of wine or having some sushi, it really, whatever positive causal there is outweighed by that even tiny utility. Okay, I hope I've said this like 4 times now in different ways. Hopefully it's clear. Here's the attendance quiz. You may notice I've changed my shirt. I've inserted this time later than recording the video, but yeah, just type this into your browser, pause it, you know the drill, and all right, we will proceed with the rest of the final lecture. Okay, one more example. So smoking, right? Smoking is known to be a positive causal factor for heart disease. But again, just because something is a positive causal factor, we've seen that doesn't determine how you should behave, right? You have to run a program for evaluating the decision. So we smoke, given that information, is the question, right? So we have some information about the effectiveness of smoking as a causal factor. And each individual can determine the value they attribute to the pleasure of smoking, right? So rather than talk about heart disease in the text, they decide to look at life expectancy, right? So we have this information: 22% of 25-year-old male non-smokers will die before 65. 38% of 25-year-old pack-a-day smokers will die before 65. So it seems like the probability of death before 65 increases with smoking. Let's suppose that this relative frequency here is taken from a large sample and we can effectively ignore margin of error. Let's also assume that non-25-year-old males will be effectively similar, right? So if this only applied to 25-year-olds, well, that's sort of a usefulness, right? But we can assume that the sample is 25-year-olds, that it's going to, people will differ, right, according to their age, but in predictable ways. And there's a 10.3 shows how that's predictable if you want to look at it. Okay, so evaluating our decision, just that little bit of information. Now we can build out our matrix and assign some probabilities and some values. So what are our options? Again, we're going to try to simplify, right? So we'll say the options are smoke a pack a day, don't smoke at all. And of course, there's lots in between there, but we need to keep it simple, right? You can, and we'll treat it as like who's making this decision, maybe a non-smoker thinking if they should start smoking, or maybe a smoker who's thinking about whether they should quit. We'll treat them as similar, right? Even though in many ways they may not be, right? If you've already smoked to some degree, you've already increased your chance of dying before 65. But as I understand it, that is largely reversible, right? If you quit, you can get a great. Okay. Step 2, states of the world. So the information we have, right, is pretty limited. It's pretty much dying before age 65 and living past 65. So those are going to be the two relevant states of the world that we're going to focus on. Step 3 are outcomes. So our matrix has only 4 outcomes: smoking and dying before age 65, smoking and living past 65, not smoking and dying before 65, and not smoking and living past 65. So similarly, a simple matrix to the contraceptive study. 2 options, 2 states of the world. All right, we are going to assign values according to the Ramsey method. So between 0 and 1. So least preferred outcome would be, and we're assuming that the decision maker likes to smoke, right? Would prefer smoking to non-smoking, all else equal. Otherwise, there wouldn't even be a point. You wouldn't need to make the decision or worry about it. We're assuming there's some value assigned to pleasure of smoking. Right? So that gives us a pretty straightforward ranking of the 4 outcomes, right? The most preferred outcome, and the one which will assign a utility of 1, is smoking and living past 65, right? You get the pleasure of smoking and you get the living. Also assume that they value living past 65. The least preferred outcome will be not getting to smoke and dying before 65 anyways. That can happen. We'll return to the intermediate utilities in a moment. That'll require a little calculation, but step 5, the strategies. Because we know the probabilities, right? This is a case of decision making with risk, right? Under known risk. All right, so now to evaluate the decision, now we actually have to fill in the matrix, right, with our values and everything. So using a similar approach, right, to the birth control example, we're going to assign a very low value to smoking, right? Like before, to see if even sort of applying a slight value makes any difference or not, right? In reality, people may value smoking much more. That's up to you. So again, another example, hopefully this helps with the Ramsey method. So we have our 4 outcomes that the ranking is fairly clear. If you like living and you like smoking, then the top preferred outcome would be getting to smoke and living past age 65. So we assign that a utility of 1, right? The worst outcome would be not getting to smoke and dying before 65. That'll get a utility of 0. And then for the intermediate probabilities, we ask ourselves, okay, here's your choice, right? You can be guaranteed the outcome, get to smoke, but you die before age 65, right? That's one choice. The other choice is we'll do a little lottery, right? And so we'll run this lottery, and there's a 1% chance you'll get to smoke and live past 65, and a 99% chance you take that bet that you'll end up not getting to smoke and not getting to live past 65. Which do you choose, right? And if you say, I don't care, like I am indifferent between these, right? Getting to smoke, but not, and knowing that I won't live past 65, right? And this little lottery where I have a tiny chance of getting to smoke and living past 65, they're like the same to me. I can't even choose, right? If that's the level where you're indifferent, right, that means that you assign a utility of 0.01% to smoking, right? And then intuitively, if smoking makes your life 1% better, then not getting to smoke makes your 1% worse. So in the situation where you don't get to smoke, but you still live past 65, well, that's a little worse, right? It's the same amount worse as getting to smoke, right? 0.1. So that's why we get 0.9 in the smoke and live past 65. So hopefully that's intuitive. That makes sense. Again, I'm not going to place a ton of weight on this in the exam. I think it's the most confusing for folks, but hopefully that helps. So now that we've got our values laid out there, right? So what we're saying here is if and on this Ramsey method, if the lottery had any higher probability, say there was a 2% chance, right, that you could smoke and live past 65 on our little lottery, you'd choose the lottery, right? That's what we're saying. And any lower, then you'd for sure take the option of guaranteed smoking and dying before 65. So anyways, that's how we're assigning the values, right? So in sort of everyday terms, that means that our agent is very risk aversive concerning smoking. They're not willing to risk very much to enjoy smoking's pleasures, or they place a relatively low value on smoking. All right, and since this is a case of decision making under risk, we do have some knowledge about the probabilities of the states of the world. We'll add those into our matrix, right? So the probability of dying before age 61, right? Given that you smoke, 0.38. Probability of living past age 65, given that you smoke, probability of 0.62, and so on, right? So we can calculate the expected utilities in the usual way. If you like, use this as an exercise to do yourself. But we get a higher expected utility, in this case, for not smoking, right? 0.772 compared to 0.62. So in this case, given these values and these probabilities, you should not smoke, right? So this is somewhat different than the contraceptive situation, right? With the contraceptive situation, we noted that If you just look at the matrix and you had no knowledge about the probabilities, it turns out you would choose to take the birth control pills, right? And then it turned out, even given the knowledge we have about, right, the causal relationship between the birth control pills and breast cancer, it still turned out that that wouldn't change your decision at all. But here the decision does change, right? If it was total uncertainty, smoking would have been the best option, right? Look back at the matrix and convince yourself it's true. But now when we add in the probabilities, our knowledge about the probability of the states of the world, it turns out that not smoking would be a better option. That may suggest why so much money and effort is spent on trying to question these studies by the tobacco industry, right? If you didn't have those probabilities, smoking does seem like a good decision, right? It's only when you have this extra knowledge about the world that it's a bad idea. But given that we do have that information, it does matter, right? So yeah, given that information, it changes the decision we should make. Now, all this is going to depend on your values, right? So definitely, if you placed a higher value on smoking than 0.01, then it's at some level, right? The calculus will shift, and it'll turn out to be a better idea to smoke. And we can even determine the exact value you'd have to put on smoking, right? Good idea, good decisions. So it just requires a little bit of basic algebra. So call the expected utility of the outcome smoking and dying before 65, call that U, right? And the expected utility of not smoking living past 65, 1 minus U, right? Just in the same way we had, right, 0.01 and 0.99, right? They were the, one was the complement of the other. So what we would want to know, like, we just sort of assigned those values, right? But we want to know what would be where the expected what would be the values that would be assigned to those boxes that would make the expected utility equal, right? So that is just this little algebra problem right here, right? So 0.38 times, right, some value. We already know the probabilities. Probabilities don't change. Plus 0.62 times 1, and that's the value we assign to the best outcome. That doesn't change. And that's going to be, at what point is that equal to, right? 0.22 times 0. Again, 0 is the value we assign to not smoking and dying anyways. That doesn't change. Plus 0.78 times 1 minus U. Right? Okay, so you solve for U, that'll give you a value of 0.14, right? So that means that smoking is a good decision if you assign that 0.14. If you value it as much as a 14 in 100 chance of dying before 65. So that's about 1 in 7, right? That's the odds of hitting 3 consecutive heads in a row. Right? That's actually 1 in 8, you know, so it's a little less than that. It seems like a fairly high value to put on smoking, right? To say, I love smoking so much that I like it as much as, like, I'm indifferent between like that and the odds of dying by an equal odds of dying to flipping heads 3 times in a row. Like, it's not so impossible to flip heads in a row. You really like smoking, right? If you say, I'll take it over that bet. Right? Okay, so that is our last sort of recorded lecture. Again, what we're going to do a review for the exam. There'll be some questions about this sort of Ramsey method. And again, don't worry about it too much. I'm not going to put weight on that for the exam. But that is it for now.